Good evening and welcome to the fourth event of our third annual Return Week, entitled The Palestinian Exodus, Turning Latin America Red. My name is Farah Kotene and I will be hosting this panel discussion on behalf of the Palestinian Return Center. أهلا وسهلا بكم في أسبوع العودة الذي يستضيفه مركز العودة الفلسطيني في لندن. This panel discussion will be focusing on the recent wave of left-wing politicians being elected across Latin America, the role of the Palestinian exodus in the electorate, the connections between the far right in Latin America and Israel, as well as the links between the left in Latin America and Palestine solidarity. When Palestine was under Ottoman rule during the 1800s and 1900s, vast waves of Palestinians fled to Latin America, fleeing Ottoman persecution. Today, the Palestinian community in Latin America is the largest Palestinian population outside of the Middle East. The Palestinian community in Latin America have played an influential role in politics across the continent, from being president to grassroots organizing on the ground. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker of this evening's panel discussion, which is Pablo Navarrete. Pablo is a British-Chilean journalist and documentary filmmaker. He is the founder and co-editor of Alborada, an independent voice on Latin American politics, media, and culture. His first feature-length documentary, Inside the Revolution, A Journey into the Heart of Venezuela, was released in August 2009 by Alborada Films. He has spoken about and covered contemporary Latin American political issues for various media outlets, including the BBC, Al Jazeera English, Russia Today, The Guardian, and Open Democracy. Over to you, Pablo.
Okay, thanks a lot, Farah, and sorry about this light that seems to be shining on my head. I can
like a halo.
Yeah, definitely not. So thank you very much, Farah, and I'd like to thank the Palestinian Return Center for inviting me to speak at this event. I've been asked to make some observations on Chile, the country that my parents are from, and its links to Palestinian solidarity. But before I do, I just want to make a few comments on Latin America and its historically strong support for the Palestinian cause. I think the glue that has cemented a strong sense of mutual solidarity between Palestine and revolutionary Latin American movements is the fact that both have faced down the imperialism of Europe, the US, and its local proxies such as Israel. Both Palestine and Latin America bear the scars of the brutality inflicted by Zionist forces and their sponsors against their domestic populations. However, colonization and destruction of attempts at self-determination by the US and Israel have been resisted and will continue to be resisted by Latin America's left and Palestinians alike. When the famous Argentinian revolutionary and icon of Cuba's liberation struggle, Ernesto Che Guevara, visited Gaza in 1959, it was, as Abu Sitta says in an article about the visit, the first sign of transforming the Zionist colonization of Palestine from a regional conflict to a global struggle against colonialism. Incidentally, we republished that article in issue Alborada. When I say we, Alborada republished that article in issue 2 of a magazine we published 3 issues of, and that was the second issue, which focused on Palestine and Latin America. And here is the issue of that second issue. So more recently in Venezuela, former President Hugo Chavez became a champion of Palestine in Latin America and beyond. I lived in Venezuela between 2005 and 2007, arguably the high point of Chavismo, and I regularly saw pro-Palestine murals around Caracas, the country's capital where I lived. It was in 2006 that Chavez condemned Israel's war against Lebanon, leading him to recall his ambassador to Israel and expel the Israeli ambassador. Chavez was a powerful voice that defended Palestine and denounced Israel's apartheid and brutality against the Palestinians. On a visit to Lebanon in 2008, I was told about the murals that existed of Chavez and how he was seen as a leader by so many for his defiance of US imperialism and Israel. Chavez was a leader widely seen to be lacking in the Arab world. After Chavez's death in 2013 and the election of his ally Nicolas Maduro to the presidency, these pro-Palestine positions have continued, although arguably to a lesser degree. It's worth mentioning also that on the 6th of August 2020, just under a year and a half after Juan Guaido, the US-backed puppet that farcically declared himself president of Venezuela in 2019, Guaido announced the opening of a virtual embassy in Jerusalem. It should come as no surprise to anyone that Guaido, who is still recognized as Venezuela's president by the UK government and others, should be an ally of Israel, while the real Venezuelan government of Maduro is viewed as an enemy by Israel. So moving on to Chile, a country with the largest population of Palestinians outside the Arab world. Chile's Palestinian community has its roots in the Christian enclaves surrounding Bethlehem, from where in the late 1800s, the first wave of migration to Latin America began. However, the community in Chile dates principally to migrants that arrived from Palestine after the First World War. Despite the fact that the majority of Palestinians are Muslims, those that arrived in Chile were of Christian origin. As time progressed, in broad terms, there was a transformation in the class composition of sectors of Palestinians in Chile, or Chilistinians as they have been called. Associated with this class transformation was a political transformation from a progressive secular community to the most visible parts of the community now being broadly conservative and part of Chile's elite. Today, the figures of Palestinians in Chile range from 300,000 to 500,000, and bear in mind that Chile's population is an estimated 19.5 million. However, it is estimated that the bodies across Chile that are organized as representing Palestinians have about 6,000 members in total. So if we take the lower figure of 300,000 Chilistinians, this means they represent only around 2% of the population. Now, if we were to ask ourselves what the most important expressions of solidarity with Palestine are in Chile today, the Club Deportivo Palestino Football Club, who play in the first division of Chile's football competition, come to the fore. The football club was originally founded in 1920 with the intention of benefiting through sport Santiago, Chile's capital's growing Palestinian community. It's been said that Palestino is the first football club ever founded by refugees globally, and parallels have been made with the thought process behind Scotland's Glasgow Celtic Football Club. Bahira Amin writes that Palestino's professionalism came after, and importantly, because of the Nakba of 1948 and the creation of Israel. Quote, when the problem started in Palestine, we wanted to create a team and name it Palestino so people would know us, end of quote, recounts Carlos Hasbun, a member of Palestino's first professional team, In Cuatro Colores, Four Colors, a documentary about the club by the Palestino's rise to global prominence, though, can largely be attributed to a kit dispute in 2014, which, when contrasted with the public displays in favor of Ukraine in football stadiums around the world recently, show once again that the claim made by FIFA that politics should be kept out of football is disingenuous, and what they really mean is that they want to keep certain politics out of football. So what took place was that in January 2014, Palestina walked out onto the pitch wearing kits with the number 1 depicting the 1947 map of Palestine before the creation of Israel. According to a complaint by Patrick Kibilski, the club president of Chilean club Nublense, quote, the figure 1 was replaced by a map of historic Palestine before the United Nations resolution of November 20th, 1947, which established a Jewish state and an Arab state. This map, which does not take into account the present state of Israel, is a symbol for the Palestinian people. These circumstances mean that its use constitutes a political matter. End of quote. Palestina was eventually fined approximately $1,300 by the Chilean Football Association and was forced to change the design of the jersey. But today, Palestino is arguably still the strongest voice of the Palestinian community in Chile, importantly offering a voice for the Palestinian struggle in Chilean society. Palestino's La Cisterna Stadium in Santiago is one of the few places in the world where the Palestinian flag waves freely, and one of the team's most popular chants is Gaza resists, Palestine exists. So I recently interviewed Daniel Jadwe, a high-profile Chilean communist politician of Palestinian descent, who has been the mayor of Recoleta municipality in Santiago since 2012. Now, Hadwe has gained attention for various things, but for example, pioneering initiatives to help low-income sectors in La Recoleta, measures that challenge the neoliberal orthodoxy forced on Chilean society after the 1973 coup, and that still remain hegemonic despite the mass protests against the system in recent years. Hadwe, perhaps because of his politics and heritage, is a major advocate of the Palestinian cause, not just in Chile, but across Latin America and the Spanish-speaking world. With regards to Palestino Football Club, Hadwe told me that it is much more than a football club. It is a political tool of the Palestinian community in Chile. Now, Hadwe is an interesting person to speak about in relation to this topic, because he was widely tipped to be the left-wing candidate in the 2021 presidential elections in Chile. And the left held primaries to choose a unity candidate to put forward. His opponent in these primaries was Gabriel Boric, a young former student leader turned politician who ended up winning the primaries, and eventually Boric also beat a far-right candidate in the presidential election runoff in late December last year. Because of the nature of these primaries, that allows non-party members to vote, even right-wing people could vote in left primaries, should they choose to. And there is much speculation that sectors of Chile's right voted for Boric in these primaries to stop Hadwe from winning. Now, to what extent an Israel lobby played a part is difficult to say with certainty. But if anything like what took place in the UK recently with Jeremy Corbyn's attempts to face down the UK establishment, including forces in his own party, took place, then it would be reasonable to expect some efforts were put into preventing Hadwe from winning that left primary to contest Chile's presidential election. Now, Hadwe is someone who's clearly, I think, viewed as a threat by the Israel lobby, much more so than Boric. I know we have another speaker that will touch on Chile, and I'm not really going to focus on Boric at all, so perhaps that speaker will. But I think Hadwe is viewed much more of a threat than Boric, who has expressed support for the Palestinian cause, but whose actions to date as president, even though it's not been that long, don't really amount to much anything of substance, although there was an incident with the new Israeli ambassador in September, where he was sent back due to the killing of teenagers in Palestine, and Boric then called him 2 weeks later, although he did apologize, I think, to the ambassador. But Hadwe, interestingly, in January 2021, in the run-up to the campaign for the left primaries, Hadwe was included in the Simon Wiesenthal Center's top 2020 list of 10 top anti-Semites. And now this is the same Wiesenthal Center that a few days before the 12th of December 2019 general election in the UK named Corbyn as its top anti-Semitic person or event for 2019, and warned that Britain would become a pariah if it elected Corbyn. So, staying in the UK, as I said earlier, my parents are Chilean, but they live in the UK, as do I. They arrived as political refugees after the US-backed coup in 1973 against Salvador Allende. And that coup ran until 1990. So I was born here and growing in the UK, growing up here, support for the Palestinian cause was always something that was mentioned in my house. Now, my parents were part of around 2,500 Chileans that came to the UK in exile from that dictatorship, and many came to Sheffield, a city in the middle of England, where I now live. Now, Chileans in Sheffield have a history of supporting solidarity with Palestine and denouncing Israel's crimes and apartheid policies. Speaking to a friend, Maria Vasquez Aguilar, who came to England aged 3, along with her parents, also political refugees, I asked why she thought Chileans in Sheffield and elsewhere, such as her, support Palestine, and she said, quote, "Chile has the largest amount of Palestinians outside of the Arab world. Growing up, they're our neighbors, our friends. We know about the Palestinian cause from a young age, and there are clear parallels, sadly, with how the Chilean state treat the Mapuche nation, the indigenous Mapuche nation, weaponization of the environment, illegal use of land, use of terrorism, doctrine to stamp down on protest, and the militarization of homeland. For many of us, a Palestinian struggle is a struggle of our ancestors. It's our struggle." So Chile's solidarity with Palestine takes different forms. We have the Palestino Football Club in Chile. We have left-wing politicians of Palestinian descent like Daniel Hadwe, and we have first and second generation Chilean exiles in countries such as the UK who embrace the Palestinian cause as part of their left-wing beliefs and activism. For me, and I'm sure many other Chileans and people of Chilean heritage, justice for Palestine is part of the internationalism and anti-imperialism that unites Chile, Latin America, and Palestine. For me, this internationalism and solidarity with Palestine is encapsulated in the poem Think of Others by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish. And I'll finish just by reading the last lines of this powerful poem, which say, as you sleep and count the stars, think of others, those who have nowhere to sleep. As you liberate yourself in metaphor, think of others, those who have lost the right to speak. As you think of others far away, think of yourself. Say, if only I were a candle in the dark. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo. Very, very insightful there. And really important link mentioned there between the Israel lobby's attempts to both take down Corbyn and take down Daniel Hadwe. That was actually the first time I'd heard that direct comparison there. Thank you again, Pablo. Our next speaker in this evening's panel discussion is Lejane El Saleh. Lejane is a member leader of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, also known as AROC, based in San Francisco, California. AROC serves poor and working class Arabs and Muslims across the San Francisco Bay Area, whilst organizing to overturn racism, forced migration, and militarism. Along with Lejane's role at AROC, she serves as the East Oakland Clean Air Project Coordinator for Communities for a Better Environment, one of the preeminent environmental justice organizations in the US. The mission of CBE is to build people power in California's communities of color and low-income communities to achieve environmental health and justice by preventing and reducing pollution and building green, healthy, and sustainable communities and environments. Over the past decade, Lejane has lived in the Bay Area and has worked on a wide range of campaigns and projects to improve public health in Northern California, Guatemala, and Mexico. Lejane holds a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science and Management and minors in professional writing and also Middle East and South Asia studies from UC Davis, and also has a Master of Public Health in Global Health and Environment from UC Berkeley School of Public Health. Over to you, Lejane.
Thank you so much, Farah. It's so, such an honor to be here and to have the opportunity to speak on behalf of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. And so I just wanted to start off by emphasizing the deep history of solidarity between Palestine and Latin America and the significance of the Palestinian diaspora and Arab communities in Latin America, and the multiple ways in which indigenous movements in Latin America have supported the Palestinian movement and the right to self-determination. While I myself have directly witnessed Zionist and Israeli efforts to expand its influence in Latin America, a presence I am deeply concerned about, I simultaneously remain inspired and hopeful in the deepening solidarity and recognition of the interconnectedness between Latin America and Palestine. I'm just going to start off with just a little bit of some more geographic context. And, it's just really important to recognize that Latin America is home to about 700,000 people of Palestinian descent, the largest population outside of the Arab world. Moreover, Chile, El Salvador, and Honduras specifically have some of the largest Palestinian diasporas outside of the Arab worlds. Along with the diaspora, there's a shared history between Latin America and Palestine, from colonization, invasion, bribery and coercion, regime change by assassination. Which country within Latin America has been untouched by the United States and Israel? As a Bolivian ambassador stated at the Conference on Palestine and Latin America in the 21st century, which was held in London in the summer of 2015, the voice of the South in support of Palestine is growing steadily stronger. Speakers from Brazil, Bolivia, Ecuador, Cuba, Chile, and Grenada reported major changes of attitude, both by governments and civil society, aided by the explosion of social media and a greater diversification of mainstream media outlets. Moreover, it is the radical left and center-left governments that have responded most strongly to Israel's repeated violations of international law, and especially to its increasingly brutal assaults on Gaza. For example, after the 2009 war on Gaza, dubbed Operation Cast Lead, Venezuela and Bolivia cut diplomatic ties with Israel. And after the killings on the Turkish aid ship to Gaza, the Mavi Marmara, in 2010, Nicaragua suspended diplomatic relations. The response to the 2014 onslaught on Gaza was also unprecedented, with El Salvador, Chile, Ecuador, Peru, and Brazil all withdrawing their ambassadors in protest, and 3 countries accusing Israel of attempted genocide. I also wanted to emphasize the decades-long solidarity that Cuba has demonstrated for Palestine. For example, Cuba's support of the UN resolution to define Zionism as a form of racism, their material support for Palestinian students to study medicine for free in Cuba, their military support for Palestinian resistance during the Palestinian Revolution, and their constant speaking out against the crimes of Zionism and imperialism in our region. Cuban diplomat Jorge Luis Garcia pointed out that Cuba was the first Latin American country to cut diplomatic ties with Israel as early as 1973. Even further back, when the UN voted on the fate of the Palestinians in 1947, pre-revolutionary Cuba was one of the 13 countries, the only one from Latin America that voted against partition. Cuba has continued to demonstrate solidarity with Palestine, consistently affirming the right of return and calling for full Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. These are just a few examples that only scratch the surface of Cuba's extensive support for Palestine across the years. While the conditions in Cuba and Gaza are much different, we recognize that what both places share in common is that they are liberated territories that are punished for the decision to pursue a path that defies the imperialist order while fighting for liberation. While the US puts millions of dollars towards propaganda campaigns to vilify Cuba, it does the same to Palestine, attempting to criminalize our resistance and whitewash the crimes of Zionist colonialism and imperialism. We realize that it is increasingly necessary for us to draw these connections and to understand that imperialist aggression might look different in different places, but that these aggressions are waged with the same goal: to destroy popular resistance, to squash national sovereignty, and to expand capitalist accumulation globally. In this way, the US attacks on Cuba must also be seen as attacks on all people struggling for their national liberation and sovereignty in the face of imperialist aggression. Along with Cuba, indigenous movements across Latin America have been among the most vocal supporters of the right of Palestinian people and self-determination. For example, Bolivia's Evo Morales, the first self-identified indigenous president in Latin America since colonization, has broken off diplomatic relations with Israel, endorsed the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement, called Israel a terrorist state, and denounced Israeli apartheid and genocide in Gaza. No other Latin American head of state has gone so far in supporting the Palestinian cause in this way. Underlying this empathy in the deep resonance of Palestinian struggles against loss of territory, state repression, colonialism, and racism, with the same struggles on the part of Latin American indigenous peoples. There are multiple dimensions between Palestinian and Latin America's indigenous causes. And on the other hand, I wanted to point out the simultaneous history of Israeli influence, especially on behalf of Benjamin Netanyahu in Latin America. Over the past decade, Netanyahu's outreach to Latin America, similar to his diplomatic efforts across Africa, Asia, and the Gulf, has been geared toward enhancing Israel's international stature. Leveraging foreign and domestic policy objectives among key Latin American nations, Netanyahu has sought to strengthen Israel's political and economic ties with the region, while simultaneously boosting his leadership credentials. In September 2017, Netanyahu became the first Israeli prime minister to visit South and Central America, making stops in Argentina, Paraguay, Colombia, and Mexico. And in his words, to mark a new era in relations between Israel and Latin America. During my time in Guatemala in the summers of 2015 and 2017, where I was studying and working on public health projects related to water quality and health in Lake Atitlan, the basin in the Western highlands of Guatemala, I was shocked when I first saw the Israeli flag in Guatemala City. I was deeply disturbed and initially was not aware of the connections between Israel and Guatemala. And in my research to understand these connections, I read Stephen Schlesinger's great groundbreaking book, Bitter Fruit, The Story of the American Coup in Guatemala. a comprehensive and insightful account of the CIA operation to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz of Guatemala in 1954. In the early 1980s, the Guatemalan military, under General Jose Efrain Rios Montt, who came to power via a military coup in 1982, backed by former US President Ronald Reagan, conducted a village massacre in Dos Eres, killing everyone except 4. In 1999, a UN-sanctioned Truth Investigation Committee found that all ballistic evidence recovered from the village scene corresponded to bullet fragments from firearms and pods of Galil rifles made in Israel. Montt's brutal campaign against the country's Mayan people also carried remarkably similar themes to some Israeli policies against Palestinians. The Israeli military's scorched earth campaign against Palestinians inspired the Guatemalan right-wing military to replicate the tactic against the country's indigenous Mayan population. Montt's Guns and Beans campaign, which offered, "If you are with us, we'll feed you. If not, we'll kill you," was almost identical to Netanyahu's economic peace plan to the Palestinians under the deal of the century, promoted by the former US President Donald Trump. According to the plan, Palestinians would be offered economic benefits when giving up their claims, many of which are enshrined in international law over occupied territories. The strong connection between Israel and Guatemala were made clear when Guatemala declared that, along with a few countries, including the United States, it would move its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem in 2018. Before the move, Guatemala's right-wing president, Jimmy Morales, supported by the country's evangelical Christians, traditional allies of Israel, explained why it would move its embassy to Jerusalem. Morales has stated, "Guatemala is historically pro-Israeli. In 70 years of relations, Israel has been our ally. We have a Christian way of thinking that, as well as the politics of it, has us believing that Israel is our ally and we must support it." Ultimately, we recognize that it is so crucial for the Palestinian and Arab movement here in the United States to extend its solidarity and to politicize our communities to show up for Latin American communities that are impacted by blockades and US imperialism in the same way that Palestine is deeply impacted. We need to revive an anti-imperialist and internationalist front that challenges US imperialism on every level. The attempt to divide us fails because Latin American and Palestinian people are linked in their struggle against US imperialism and Zionism. We do not take this connection for granted, and we know that we as Palestinians must do the work of building international solidarity and to allow all people to live in dignity and demonstrate to the world that an anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist world is possible. Long live international solidarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lejane. Very insightful there and very well put. And if just possible to mention one point, to extend one point you made there about Cuban solidarity with Palestine. Cuban solidarity with Palestine has been one of the staunchest forms of solidarity in modern Palestinian history. And I think one example of that is how for the past 30 years, the United Nations has voted amongst all member states, amongst 193 member states, to end the US's brutal blockade of Cuba. And whilst the vast majority of those member states are voting to end that brutal American blockade of Cuba, there are 2 countries consistently voting every single year for 30 years to sustain that brutal blockade of Cuba. And those 2 countries are, of course, America and Israel, both entities that are upholding brutal blockades themselves. Thank you very much, Lejane. Our next speaker of this panel discussion is Ignacio Asfura. Ignacio is a Palestinian Chilean economist from the University of Santiago. He has a master's in international development and is also a member of the current Chilean President's Party, Gabriel Boric's Convergencia Social. I do apologize for my pronunciations there. Over to you, Ignacio.
Thank you, Farah. It was a good pronunciation. Well, first of all, I would like to thank Renato Vélez. Latin American politics, despite me being Latin American, is not my core expertise area. So thanks to Renato for helping me to structure this speech in a more comprehensive way. And also, sorry or forgive me about my English. I hope to be good at the pronunciation. So I would like to start this speech and this presentation with the early connections of Israel with Latin America, which we can trace back as early as the 40s and till the 90s, especially with Central American dictatorships, helping, for example, the Somoza family, the Salvadorian death squads, or for example, the DINA military police in Chile. But after these early connections with Latin America, especially as arm and weapon supplier or military training, Israel has continued its connection to Latin America. Well, after this period of dictatorships, Latin America in the 80s and the 90s, and some countries in the 80s, other ones a bit later, started a period of neoliberal policies based on the Washington Consensus, policies of liberalization, which, for example, with governments from center left to center right, with Frei in Chile, for example, Menem in Argentina, or for example, Fujimori in Peru. And this period, and this is the core of the presentation, is going to be, of this speech is going to be the last 20 years. And so the first, the period that followed this period of neoliberal policies was this phenomenon known today as the pink tide, which saw a series of progressive, socialist, and left-wing governments in Latin America as a response of these neoliberal policies. These were governments with a focus on social injustice, on solving social inequalities, with key figures like, for example, this period began around 1999 and last around 2013. His key figures was mainly Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, of course, but also other like Lula da Silva in Brazil, Néstor Kirchner and Cristina Fernández in Argentina, Michelle Bachelet in Chile, Rafael Correa in Ecuador, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Pepe Mujica in Uruguay, among others. So this period in geopolitically was a period of Latin America mostly acting as a bloc with an idea of Latin Americanism, of South-South cooperation, with the development and the creation of regional organization led by Venezuela, like UNASUR or ALBA. This also was a period of, in some cases, for example, Venezuela especially, of direct confrontation with the U.S. foreign policy. We can see the same in other countries as Argentina or Brazil, but anyway, they were looking for multilateralism, for example, and challenging the U.S. foreign policy. For example, Lula da Silva was promoting meetings between South American governments and the Arab world. He joined Brazil to BRICS with Russia, China, India, and South Africa. So it was a period of Latin America acting cohesively and trying to challenge with different levels, of course, the U.S. foreign policy. And this period was allowed mainly thanks to good economic conditions, known as the commodity boom, in which the prices of the raw materials exported by Latin American countries were rising, and the economic conditions allowed this government, this leftist government, to pursue their geopolitical objectives. But what this means for Palestine? What were the implications for Palestine of this period? Well, for example, I'm going to give some examples. Well, as Pablo said before, Bolivia and Venezuela breaking up diplomatic relations with Israel. Many countries in South America recognizing Palestine as a state, Well, the first was Paraguay and Venezuela, but the most, I think, the Lula da Silva, Brazil's Lula was the most important of them, because after that, and just a couple of weeks, Argentina, Ecuador, Peru, Chile, and Uruguay recognized Palestine as a state, most of them with the 67 borders. But for example, Chile without acknowledge any border. So there were also strong support in the speech. Lula is known because of for their support for Palestine. Also, the same goes to Hugo Chavez. So this was, of course, a period of Latin America, of Latin American anti-imperialistic rhetoric, solidarity with Palestine. So, in general terms, these were good news for Palestine. But sadly, this pink tide reached to an end around 2013 with a series of events as the Hugo Chavez death, the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, the winning of Sebastián Piñera in Chile, the political crisis in Paraguay, the political crisis in Venezuela, and the coup d'etat in Honduras, and a series of events that ended this period of left-wing governments. And here in Latin America, we saw the rising of the right and the far-right governments known as the conservative wave, which may be the most iconic of them being Jair Bolsonaro's Brazil. This period saw in internal politics, of course, and also in regional politics, a pursuit of dismantling the regional organizations created in the previous period, and of course with a strong focus in debilitating and isolating Venezuela, and rising this puppet figure of Juan Guaidó in Venezuela. So this period saw also an increased support for Israel, especially in far-right governments as Bolsonaro, who opened a commercial bureau in Jerusalem and manifested his intention to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Other far-right countries or governments as Guatemala, Honduras, despite having a big Palestinian community, and Paraguay did move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Another implication for Palestine was, for example, the good relations of Mauricio Macri with Benjamin Netanyahu, the visiting of Benjamin Netanyahu to Argentina and Brazil, among other countries. So this period saw an increasing support for Israel, and of course, a debilitation of the previous organizations and cohesion of Latin American cohesion that we saw in the previous period, and the intent to replace this organization with new one like Prosur with a different ideology. But of course, this period also ended. At least for the moment. I wouldn't be so optimistic about that, but and now we are seeing a new period of that has to be known as a new pink tide, which is of course very different from the previous one. It's a much weaker, I would say, pink tide. Is more moderate in geopolitical terms. It is also less aggressive, we could say, towards the U.S. foreign policy, and also this second pink tide has a much weaker context in terms of the economic conditions because of the COVID, but also because of the rising inflation and economic crisis. So the second pink tide is in a weaker position to compare to the first pink tide. The most important thing, or one important thing to mention about this second pink tide is the individual position of some presidents, like for example Gabriel Boric, that has expressed this support for Palestine, or for example Gustavo Petro, who also in Colombia has expressed his support for Palestine, but sadly, despite having being good news to have left-wing governments in Latin America, we can expect them to be as good as the first pink tide. And one of the key facts, or one of the key factors, is also the critical condition of the crisis in Venezuela, which now is viewed as a liability for many of these governments. The right wing uses Venezuela every time, everywhere, in sometimes ridiculous ways. But now it's the country that was leading the process of the first pink tide. It's now mostly a liability. So despite the solidarity of the Latin American left with Palestine, it's hard to see real steps beyond, for example, what happened between Gabriel Boric and the Israeli ambassador, or beyond some declaration criticizing Israel. It's hard to see more concrete actions like breaking, for example, diplomatic relations. I would say I will talk about also the special situation, I forgot to mention it before, of Colombia, which it's maybe the closest ally to Israel in South America, thanks to the close relation of Colombia with the United States, with even American military bases inside Colombian territory. So Colombia's right-wing governments have been close allies to Israel, when Israel has played their key role as arms supplier and military training to Colombia's military. So and also I would like to mention the special case of Chile, which, as it was said before, it has the biggest Palestinian community outside the Middle East. And so in this case, of course, we see more support for Palestine and more solidarity for Palestine in the left. But in Chile happened a curious case, and in which you saw some solidarity, maybe not with real convictions, more interest, but you saw some solidarity with Palestine, even in right-wing politicians. Some of them Palestinians or Chilestinians, but others without a connection to Palestine, just because they are friends or they have connections to wealthy Palestinian conservative businessman or politicians. So in conclusion, I would say that this second pink tide are, of course, good news for Palestine, but sadly it's different. It's in a different position compared to the previous one, and that's why it's so important, for example, that Lula, a strong Brazil, I hope so. I hope that Brazil and Lula is going to have a leading role in this new pink tide. So in order to be in a stronger position, but by now, and for that, it's very important the economic conditions and the economic independence of Latin America, which is still a dependent region in the periphery, sadly. So in order to help have a cohesive and anti-imperialistic position, it's important it's important a strong Brazil and the solving of the situation in Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ignacio, for your input there. Very insightful and informative. And just to touch on something that you mentioned, and also Pablo mentioned earlier, was the connection and the parallel even between kind of settler colonial brutality in Palestine, that Israeli settler colonial brutality, and then that impacts on the indigenous Palestinian population, but then also what's happening in Chile with the indigenous Mapuche people. And just drawing on the past Chilean election, it's of no coincidence that the far-right candidate, Jose Antonio Cast, there was Israeli flags flying, whilst also he was spouting dangerous rhetoric about the indigenous Mapuche people and really terroristic policies he would implement against them. And we have to draw those parallels there. Thank you very much, Ignacio. Our next speaker of this panel discussion is Leonardo Schioquet. Leonardo studied social anthropology in Brazil and acquired his PhD at Boston University. He specializes in Palestine, and his research focuses on forced migration, refugee studies, rituals, affiliations, ethnicity, and the relationship between the Middle East and Austria. Over to you, Leonardo.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. So the Palestinian Declaration of Independence established Palestine as a de jure sovereign state on November 15, 1988, during an extraordinary session in exile of the Palestinian National Council, the Majlis al-Watani al-Falastini, which is the legislative body of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, and elects the PLO Executive Committee. Since then, international recognition of the State of Palestine has been one of the primary objectives of the PLO and now of the Palestinian National Authority, the PNA. Within 2 weeks, this declaration was swiftly acknowledged by 55 nations, such as China, the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and India. In the 131st session of the UNESCO held in Paris in May 12, 1989, 92 countries formally recognized it. The USA, led by Reagan then, was initially reticent, given the supposed involvement of the PLO with terrorist acts and the non-recognition of the State of Israel, and so most of Europe followed this position. Exceptions were Austria, Bulgaria, Cyprus, the GDR, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Ukrainian SSR and Yugoslavia, all then part of the Eastern Bloc, with Cyprus and Greece being under strong influence, Soviet influence then. Only 2 Latin American countries were among these acknowledging the State of Palestine, Cuba and Nicaragua. Of course, both were also under considered Soviet influence. So this picture certainly reinforces the idea that turning Latin America red would be a boon for Palestine. Yet the world since then moved a great deal from the realpolitik of the Cold War, and along with the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc is no more. In 1991, the USA and the Soviet Union co-sponsored the famous Madrid Conference, one of the outcomes having been the rapprochement of the Soviet Union, India, and China to Israel. The present war in Ukraine and the Russian strategic partnership with Israel are just the latest unequivocal signs of the much more complex and diffuse patchwork nature of contemporary international relations. The same can be said of Turkey's own interest in the Middle East and of the recent rapprochement between Israel and the Gulf countries, and how countries such as India and Brazil have considered their relations with Russia and Ukraine. Austria and Germany have also developed strong ties to Israel as a form of attuning to their responsibility in the Jewish Holocaust. Both countries now have established left-wing political sectors aligned either with the Palestinian cause or with Israel. It is within this changing global political framework, when already 132 states, members of the United Nations, had accorded recognition of the State of Palestine, that on November 29, 2012, Palestine became a non-member observer of the UN General Assembly. This move has been seen ever since as pivotal to the international recognition of the State of Palestine. And as of 2019, 139 of the 193 United Nations member states and 2 non-member states have bilaterally recognized it. So how does Latin America, and particularly Brazil, fit this picture? Well, Brazil first established relations with Palestine as early as 1975, when the PLO is authorized to appoint a representative to Brasilia. But only in 1993, Brazil authorized the Palestinian Special Delegation in Brasilia, with foreign organization diplomatic status. Yasser Arafat personally visits Brazil in 1995, and in 1998, the delegation has its status upgraded to that of equivalent of an embassy. But it's only in 2004 that Brazil establishes an office of its own in Ramallah, and in 2005, when a representative of Brazil in official business, Celso Amorim, then International Relations Minister, visits Palestine. In the same year, Mahmoud Abbas returns the diplomatic visit to Brazil in the frame of the Summit of the South American Arab Countries, or ASPA. Celso Amorim would visit Palestine again in 2008, 2009, 2010, while Mahmoud Abbas would visit Brazil again in 2009 after the visit of Palestinian Minister of Foreign Businesses, Riyad Malki, visits Brazil in 2008. Meanwhile, in 2007, Brazil donates 10 million in humanitarian help to the Palestinian territories and 3 million more, along with India and South Africa through IBSA, so India, Brazil, and South Africa Forum. In 2009, again, Brazil donates 10 million to the reconstruction of Gaza. And in 2010, Riyad Malki and the Fatah Commissary for International Relations, Nabil Shaath, visits Brazil on separate occasions. And former and again incoming president of Brazil, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, visits Palestine. In the same year, Lula recognized the PLO as legitimate representative of the Palestinian people since 1975 and the state of Palestine within the 1967 borders, despite not having full diplomatic relations with Palestine. This move was fundamental to the IBSA, so thus Brazil, India, and South Africa joint declaration of the acknowledgement of East Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state still in 2010. In 2011, Mahmoud Abbas visits Brazil on Dilma Rousseff's ceremony of inauguration as the president of Brazil, which marked the continuity of the Workers' Party, PT, in power in Brazil, and declares that a UN peacekeeping force in Palestine should count with Brazilian military presence to protect Palestine. In the same year, with Brazil's co-sponsorship, the UN General Assembly approves Resolution 67/19, which elevates the status of Palestine within the UN as a non-member observer. In 2014, then Brazil donates 11,500 tons of rice to the UNRWA, marking the last major Brazilian contribution to Palestine. Diplomatic visits between Palestine and Brazil continued steadily until 2016, when Rousseff was impeached from the Brazilian government in a very controversial move led by dissidents within her own government. The Palestinian embassy in Brazil records only 2 more diplomatic visits after this period, one in 2017 and another in 2018, before Jair Messias Bolsonaro is elected as the new Brazilian president. So during this time of cooperation, the so-called Palestinian diaspora in Brazil founded the Brazilian Committee of Palestinian National Interest, PBNIC, a popular movement representing the interest of Palestine in Brazil. I must note that I have my issues with the term Palestinian diaspora, actually also with exodus in a sense, and prefer to call it from now on a Palestinian exile or exiles, as I point out in a recent publication of mine. I mean, just in 2 seconds here, the issue is that since I have done field work with Palestinian refugees in Latin America, but also mostly also in Europe, but mostly in Lebanon, the refugees always talked about this as using the word ghurba and not shatat. Shatat also in diaspora is a modern word that is just entered the vocabulary through academics and then gets popularized since the 1980s, especially since the 1990s. Whereas ghurba is also much more than just a concept, just doesn't mean just spread out in the world, but it really is an emotional complex. It's about feelings and emotions. So, and it also can be translated as exile. So I would prefer to use that term, but that's a discussion that we could have. We can further discuss this if you want, but anyway, let's move on. The PBNIC is but one recent institution formed by Brazilians of Palestinian origins. Others, such as Sanawood, student organization, and FEPAL, the Palestinian Arab Federation of Brazil, being much older. If the PBNIC, within the frame of the PLO, can be said to have been instrumental in securing Lula's support for Palestine, members of Sanawood and FEPAL have been historically close to PT, the Workers' Party, for decades before that, many as members of PT itself. If we saw a total halt in the official partnership between Brazil and Palestine after 2016, the same cannot be said true for Palestinian-based social movements pushing for the development of these relations. It's also important to note that if in Brazil, Palestinians have historically been overwhelmingly aligned with left-wing parties, notably PT, but also more recently with PSOL, Socialism and Liberty Party, the same cannot be said with the same conviction of Palestinians in other parts of Latin America. Significant numbers of Palestinians in Chile and Paraguay, for example, supported the right-wing dictatorships of Pinochet and Stroessner, respectively. And for more of this, you can read, for example, the work of Cecilia Baeza and John Tufik Karam. But as Helena Manfrinato states in her doctoral dissertation, the left-wing parties in Brazil focus their efforts on what she calls possibilities of coalition and solidarity, which is often disconnected to the reality of the Middle East, including Palestine. This strategy does not necessarily approximate Palestinian social movements in the Middle East to those in Brazil. I mean, it often does, but sometimes it doesn't. So this is so because since the interests are mediated by Brazilian contextual interests and institutions foregrounding them. So through my field work in Brazil, between around 2011 and 2012, I perceived how such interests were grossly reshaped by the arrival of Palestinian refugees from Iraq in 2007. Same group or another part of this group also went to Chile, and so the colleagues working with Chile can also remember that. And this arrival called for the redesigning the terms of solidarity and political articulation within Brazil. And as Manfrinato states, the further arrival of Palestinian refugees from the Syrian conflict in 2015 dramatically deepened this change. So social movements such as MOPAT, or Movimento Palestino para Todos, or Palestine for All movement, for example, was created during this period to contrapose the politics of FEPAL, so the Palestinian Arab Federation of Brazil. When the latter group of Palestinians joined an urban occupation in São Paulo, named Leila Khaled in honor of the Palestinian activists, MOPAT is able to muster significant resources, ideological and material, within the Brazilian left, independently and often against PT. As Bárbara Caramuru's research among Palestinians in Brazil and Chile shows, this brought about a change in the direction of political participation, not only within the Brazilian left, but also among Palestinians in Brazil as well. According to her, the historical alignment of earlier generations of Palestinians with FEPAL and their children's participation in the re-articulation of Sanaoud is intrinsically tied to the Workers' Party, and thus with the PLO and the PNA. So for this group in general, Hamas, for example, is generally considered an extremist group, fundamentalist in their imposition of religion as frame for the Palestinian cause, perceived as secular. Now, so the Palestinian cause, which is then in turn perceived as secular, and tied to global left-wing politics. PSOL, in turn, is much more inclined to support political tendencies such as Hamas and others. So I want to conclude now with my own impressions, which are largely based on my own fieldwork observations in Europe, particularly in Austria and Denmark, but also significantly informed by my consultation with Brazilian colleagues studying the Palestinian exile in Brazil. And these are especially Bárbara Caramuru and Helena Manfrinato, as I just mentioned, and the members of the Middle East Research Center, NEON, at the Fluminense Federal University in Rio de Janeiro. If you were to apply the label of left and right-wing politics to the Middle East, which is a gross oversimplification of the way the Palestinian cause is framed in the Middle East, I would think, one would have to conclude that what in Brazil is left-wing, for example, the PLO and the PNA, could be interpreted in the Middle East, and particularly in Palestine, as right-wing politics. And this is so precisely because the institutions and strategies generally identified as the left in Brazil, but also in much of Latin America and in Europe, depend on what Manfrinato identifies as politics of coalition and solidarity, and must coalesce, align with, and develop around an international global agenda locally relevant. So locally relevant from Brazil or from Chile and so on and so forth. From a Middle Eastern perspective, in turn, the Palestinian cause is often the ultimate frame within which other agendas must fit. In fact, everything must make sense. So will the rise of the left in Latin America represent a significant change for Palestine? Well, that depends on who gets to define and represent the interests of Palestine and the Palestinians. As I have presented so far, the left in Brazil, more decisively so in Brazil perhaps than in some other Latin American contexts, has supported official Palestinian institutions within international frame. But this has been so, of course, only according to Brazil's own terms. As Manfrinato and Caramuru pointed out to me, even now Lula is already articulating its future policies with Palestinian organizations, especially the Palestinian exiles in Brazil. Yet, Lula has also already announced that his next term will be dedicated to diminish the unsurmountable differences between Brazilians, almost half of which voted to elect Jair Bolsonaro this year. And that support, I think, and this is only my speculation now, will only come within the frame of the internationally recognized representative of Palestinians and acknowledged sovereign Palestine Authority, the PNA. And insofar as this articulation does not interfere with the bold mission of uniting those in Brazil who support Palestinian rights to self-determination on one side, and those who vehemently condemn it on the other. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Leonardo. Very, very well put. And you mentioned some really, really important points there. I think there's also a class element that needs to be brought in when talking about the Palestinian community in Latin America, but also as well your point on calling Palestinians in the diaspora exiled instead of exodus, which is a very important point. And I don't know if you've seen all the footage that's coming out of the World Cup. There are a few England fans saying free Palestine whilst also saying coming home, like football's coming home. And then Palestinians have now claimed that phrase as Palestinians are coming home, as in the right of return, which I think is very telling of where solidarity is right now with Palestine. Thank you, Leonardo. Our final speaker of this panel discussion is Gabriel Huland. Gabriel is a journalist and is now, I believe, a fellow at SOAS University of London. He recently published For or Against War, the Syrian Conflict on New York Times opinion pages in the Journal of Communication and Media Studies. Before moving to London, he lived in Spain, Costa Rica, and Brazil, where he grew up and has his family. He worked as the editor of, I'm really apologize for the pronunciation, Pagina Roja, an independent Spanish newspaper, and as a researcher at the Latin American Institute of Socioeconomic Studies in Brazil. His research interests include migration, international politics, labor movements, news framing, and media policy. Gabriel has recently become a teaching fellow in Middle East Studies at SOAS. Over to you, Gabriel.
Hello, Farah. I hope you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly.
Okay, so first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this discussion. I think it's a very important discussion and very timely. We are seeing now this new government that's being formed in Israel with Netanyahu coming back to power and forming this alliance, which will be even more right-wing if it's possible. It will be more right-wing and more conservative and more extremist than the previous Israeli government. So in this context, in which the policies of colonization and occupation of Palestine will probably increase in the next period, and also in an international context in which we are seeing many countries, especially in the Arab world, renormalizing relations with Israel, such as the UAE, Morocco, and other countries. The solidarity with the Palestinian people in their struggle against the Jewish state of Israel and against the colonization of their land, I think assumes even more importance in the current situation. Also, I would like to say that linking this discussion to Latin America is really important, not only because in Latin America we have more than 20 million people of Arab descent, mainly Palestinians, Lebanese, Syrians, but also because I believe that the situation that we have now in Latin America, despite this new pink tide, as it's being called by some academics and some politicians, I think we are living in Latin America one of the worst economic crises in the last 30 or 40 years since the implementation of neoliberal policies in the region. In my country, for example, in Brazil, the situation is really complicated. We have 30 million people without food security right now. We have 40 million people working in very, very precarious situations without contracts and informality. I think this very dire economic situation we also see it in other countries of the region. And because of this, I think there will be, I'm not so sure that this new pink wave governments, Lula in Brazil and Boric in Chile, Fernandez in Argentina, Petro in Colombia, I was going to say Castillo in Peru, but just these days we saw that he's not the president of Peru anymore. I'm not so sure to what extent these governments will be able to address these structural problems that we have in the region. So we might see in the next years a new wave of protests and uprisings in Latin America. So this puts the situation in Latin America and Palestine very close, because the ties and the solidarity between these two regions need to be reinforced and strengthened. I prepared my presentation about the history of Israel and Latin America. I will try to be very brief, because I think some of my colleagues already touched upon some of the points that I was going to say, so I'll try not to overlap with what some of my colleagues already spoke. But the history and the ties between Israel and Latin America, they go back to the 40s. Actually, the session of the United Nations who voted the partition plan in 1947 was presided by a Brazilian diplomat, Osvaldo Aranha. Although Brazil abstained in the vote in the partition plan, but as Aranha was instrumental in helping the Israeli lobby to gain more votes for the plan. Also, the partition plan, some Guatemalan and Uruguayan officials helped to devise and to create the plan. They were instrumental in that as well. After the plan was voted and after they created the State of Israel in 1948, during the Nakba, most Central and South American states recognized the State of Israel. So it was important in the creation of Israel. During the Cold War, Israel was a very important supplier of arms and training to Latin American dictatorships and paramilitary groups. Of course, the experience that they had gained in Palestine, colonizing the country, expelling the people from their villages, burning some villages, all the killings and the torture that they imposed on the Palestinian people were very helpful for the dictatorships that were in power in the region in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So they really helped not only training the armies of these dictatorships, but they also supplied a lot of weapons. I think they were the second most important supplier of weapons to many regimes after the United States. Latin America represented in that period 1/3 of all of Israel's arms sales. Some people said that Israel actually went where the US could not go. So some places or some things that the US could not do because it would seem very bad for them. Israel did this dirty job. After 1967, there was in the Six-Day War and the occupation of the Golan Heights, the Sinai, Jerusalem, parts of the West Bank, the pro-Palestinian sentiment grew in Latin America. But Israel knew how to play with this, and they had a very pragmatic foreign policy, even though they knew that there were more resistance to what they were doing in Palestine. They also were very intelligent in how to maintain good relationship with the regimes that were there, and keep improving their position in the region. After the Cold War, in the 90s and the 2000s, pro-Palestinian movements grew even stronger. After the establishment of the BDS, in 2004, I think, there was a lot of support for the BDS in the region. When we had the first wave of leftist governments in Latin America, Chavez, Lula in 2002, Correa in Ecuador, and also in Argentina. We had it was a very ambiguous situation because on one hand, diplomatic relations with Palestine increased a lot. And for example, what my colleague just mentioned, that Brazil established in 2004, I think, or 2005, a diplomatic mission in Palestine. That was very important. And myself, when I went to Palestine the first time, I had a meeting with the Brazilian diplomats that were in Ramallah. And of course, that was very important because I think it was the first time a Brazilian government actually had a diplomatic mission or an office in Palestine. So on one side, there was the recognition of Palestine, and on the diplomatic level, there was an improvement of the relations with Palestine. But during these governments, it was also the period in which Israel actually improved a lot their position in the region. So in 2007, they established the Israeli-Mercosur Free Trade Agreement. So the economic ties of Israel with Latin America right now include security, like weapons, training, drones, cybersecurity, and also development projects. In 2017, Netanyahu visited Latin America 4 times. In 2009, President Shimon Peres went to Brazil, and it was the first visit of an Israeli president to Brazil in 40 years. Shimon Peres went to Brazil accompanied by a delegation of more than 40 representatives of top Israeli companies in water technology, agriculture, communications, energy, medical equipment, and defense. So today Israel has free trade agreements with Mexico, Mercosur, and Guatemala. And there's also a free trade agreement with Colombia and Panama that it's not yet in force, but is about to be in force. So during the period of the first so-called leftist wave in Latin America, Israel improved their position a lot in the region. And this has to do with this more like a pragmatic approach from this government. For example, in the case of Brazil, in 2017, the total trade between Brazil and Israel was more than $400 million. That's not a lot if you take into consideration the whole foreign trade of Brazil, but it's relevant. It's very relevant. And the total trade between Brazil and Palestine in the same year, 2017, was 27 million. So the trade between Israel and Brazil is more than 20 times or almost 20 times more than between Palestine and Brazil. Of course, when we had the right-wing governments in Brazil, the situation was worsened a lot. We know that Bolsonaro in Brazil has a lot of sympathies for Israel. Israeli flags. We could see Israeli flags during his campaign. I think he was the first president of any country to go visit Israel after he was elected. He was actually baptized. He went there to be baptized. We know of the relationship that Bolsonaro has with the evangelical church, which defend are Zionists and are pro-Israel, and how the evangelical church was so important in the alliance that Bolsonaro built in the elections that we had in Brazil this year. But also there were some problems. For example, when Bolsonaro announced in the beginning of his government that he was going to improve ties with Israel and try to he opened the foreign office, business office in Israel. There was a lot of backlash from some Arab countries, and that impacted a lot in Brazil, because Brazil has a lot of commercial relations with the Arab world. For example, Brazil is the most important supplier of meat to the Arab world. So of course, when Bolsonaro said that he was going to try to increment the relationship with Israel, some Arab countries, some producers in Brazil knew that this could have an impact on the commercial relations between Brazil and the Arab world. So there was also this. He was not able to implement his agenda towards Israel as much as he wanted. So in this context of this relationship between Israel and Latin America that has been growing, I would say, it's important to try to discuss what the new governments that are in power now in Latin America will do, like the Lula in Brazil, or Fernandez in Argentina, Petro in Colombia. I think the pragmatic approach will continue. Diplomatic relations with Palestine will improve, probably. Brazil has historically defended a two-state solution. I don't think this will change in the next government of Lula. But of course, it will be much different than it was during Bolsonaro. But I think the pragmatic approach will continue, because the ties between security ties, weapons supplying ties with Brazil will continue. For example, the Brazilian military police receives training from the IDF, and for example, some of the policies that were implemented in Brazil during the World Cup of 2014, which they called pacification, when the military police went to the communities, to the poor communities in Brazil that we call favelas, to pacify and fight the organized crime. These techniques, to a great extent, they learned that from the IDF. So there's a lot of ties between, and this all happened during the Lula government. No, not Lula, not Dilma, sorry. So I think the pragmatic approach will continue. They will continue their relationship with Israel, but they will also try to have some ties with Palestine. But I'm not so sure to what extent they'll be willing to really, for example, enforce some kind of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. I don't think they will do anything of the sort. It will be more a symbolic support for Palestine than actually something that will materialize in concrete policies, sanctions, divestment, cutting relationships, not only sending the ambassadors back, but cutting economic ties with Israel. I don't think this will happen. So, as many of my colleagues already have spoken, the solidarity is growing a lot with on the ground, the grassroots movement in Latin America, in Brazil, in Chile, and many other countries. And the sympathy towards Palestine is growing and will continue to grow. But I think this will not have a reflection on the institutional level of the government. So I think it's an ambiguous moment that we are entering. That was more or less what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for your input there. I just wanted to even just to extend the point that you mentioned, especially about the recent elections in Brazil. I think one of the most bizarrest images that came out of those elections was Bolsonaro's wife, the president's wife, the First Lady of Brazil, when she was going out to vote, she was wearing a T-shirt with an Israeli flag on it. It was one of the most bizarrest visuals I think I've seen. Usually, you don't really see kind of any other country mentioned, especially on an election day of a foreign country. And I think that sign, wearing that shirt, really emphasized kind of where Bolsonaro's interests lied, who was supporting his presidential campaign. And even one sentence that he said that stuck with me was that in terms of Latin America, Israel would go where sometimes America wouldn't. And just a few examples of that as well. Israel's role in the Mayan genocide, Israel's role in arming and supporting the dictatorship of Pinochet, also arming Chile's police repression in previous years, as well as training Colombia's police, and as you said as well, Brazil's police, also arming and training
military groups in Nicaragua and El Salvador. Sorry.
Yeah, arming the death squads in El Salvador as well. Also, deep relations with Nicaragua's corrupt dictatorship. The list goes on, and there is spouts of information that viewers can find if they want more details about this online. Just wanted to wrap up, as that is unfortunately all that we have time for today. Just wanted to finally thank all of our speakers. So thank you to Pablo, thank you to Lejane, thank you Ignacio, thank you Leonardo, and thank you Gabriel for all of your inputs in this evening's panel discussion. We do have one final event left of Return Week, and that is tomorrow at 7 p.m. It's the closing event of Return Week, and we will be hearing from Palestinian musicians who will be performing traditional and Palestinian folklore songs, literature, and poetry. And that will be tomorrow at 7 p.m. Same place on YouTube, same place on Facebook, and it will also be recorded if you want to watch it later on. And that is all from me. Thank you very much for tuning in.